It's Jenny from the WOW design team, and today I'm joining you with 3 cards that all use the same technique, and that is an all over embossing panel technique. We're going to be using lots of different sparkly and shiny embossing powders, and I'm also going to give you a look at the new heat tool. So let's get started. So for your supplies, you're going to need the embossing ink. This is the embossing ink pad from WOW. It is more sturdy than other embossing pads that you might be familiar with, and the ink stays wet much longer, so you have much more time to play around with your embossing powder. Now this is a look at the new Dual Heat Ultimate Embossing Heat Tool, which is awesome. I just got this in the mail and I've had so much fun using it, and you'll see it in action in this video. I'm also using a large selection of embossing powders, and of course the new WOW Superior Smooth White cardstock, which is 250 GSM. You get 25 sheets in a pack. Here's a quick comparison of the colour of the cardstock against a sheet of, I think this is Nina Solar White. You can see how bright white it is, and it's also super smooth, and it makes it great for embossing on. And here's a quick look at the new heat tool. It's got a stand, so you can put it down without worrying about burning your table or your craft desk. It's got 2 settings. I'm going to be using setting 2 today, which is hotter, and the first setting is more for if you're drying watercolours or mixed media projects. Make sure when you hold the tool that you don't cover over the vents that are near the switch, because that's actually where some of the heat escapes. So your best bet is to hold it towards the centre, around where the grey panel is. Now to start off with, I'm using some of the smooth white cardstock that I've trimmed down to an A2 size panel of 4 1/4 inches by 5.5 inches. And I'm applying the embossing ink directly from the embossing pad all over the surface of the panel of the cardstock. Now, I was experimenting a little bit here, and at first I was tapping it, but actually the best way to do this is to swipe. You get a really good all-over coverage on the panel by doing this. And then we're going to bring in some embossing powder. So I'm using Metalline First Frost, which is a beautiful pale blue with a metallic sheen once it's been heated. And I'm going to sprinkle it all over the panel that we have just added our embossing ink to. And one thing to note, I'm using a stack of paper here behind my panel. What I do is I swipe my embossing ink over the panel, and then I remove that first top sheet of, it's just copy paper, because I don't want to waste my embossing powder. If I'd left it there, that embossing powder that's fallen onto the sheet there will have stuck to the excess embossing ink on the copy paper, and I don't want that because I want it back in my pot. So you can then tip it back into the pot and nothing has stuck on. So that's one of my tips for making sure you get everything you can out of your little pots of embossing powder. I'm now going to bring in the heat tool. I've got it set to setting 2, which is the fast, powerful, hot setting. I actually did not heat up my heat tool, and you can see how quickly this embosses the embossing powder. I also have not used this embossing tool prior to creating this card. This was my first run at the heat tool, so I was super impressed with how quickly it started to melt the powder. And you can also see, this is a really good way of seeing how wide a disbursement you're getting of the heat itself. So you can see it's not super concentrated in a tiny area, it's actually spreading and embossing the powder in quite a wide area. I've probably got my heat tool about 2-3 inches off the panel here, and I don't feel like I'm at risk of burning anything by doing what I'm doing here, which I know some other heat tools, they have super concentrated blasts of hot air and you end up burning your embossing glitter particularly. Now, that has completed the first layer. We are going to go in and repeat the process again. I highly recommend waiting for your panel to cool down. It will take 10-15 seconds. You can maybe waft it around a little bit. Otherwise you might end up getting some embossing powder sticking where it hasn't fully cooled and hardened. And you're just going to swipe your embossing ink directly over the top of the panel again and repeat by adding another layer. Now again, remember to remove the copy paper that has the embossing ink on it. It's not a waste of paper, you can reuse what you used before. Just either flip it over or bring back the other one, don't throw it away. And that way you're not wasting sheets and sheets and sheets of copy paper. And then just melt it again. And so here's a look at the panel after I have done 5 layers. So you're going to need to do 5 layers for this technique to work with the background stamp. So here I am using a background stamp. This is by My Favourite Things. All of the supplies I'm using will be in the description box below and over on the blog. A link to the blog post will be also included in the description box. I've added the background stamp into my MISTI and lined it up directly into the corner. I've then added my embossed panel also into the corner. That's kind of important because you're going to need to push this down a few times, so you want to make sure it lines up. I'm then heating the panel. I want to get the embossing powder layers that we've added into a more liquid state so that they'll be ready to take an impression from the background stamp. Now I am aware that the background of the MISTI is plastic, so just be careful, you don't want to go melting your MISTI, but I'm not adding too much heat, just enough to get through the 4 or 5 layers of embossing powder on the panel itself. I did not damage my MISTI in any way, but just be careful. I'm then heating and stamping. You can see here I'm getting in some good muscle work and pushing down really hard with my arms. You want to get an impression from that background stamp embedded into the melted embossing powder. And it took me 3 or 4 goes. I did add a couple of blasts of heat in between. If you mess it up, it is not a wasted panel. You can go in with your heat tool, reheat the entire panel, and every piece of the image will be gone. And this is what you get at the end. It just looks so beautiful in real life. I finished it off by adding it to a £110 Nina Solar White card base and added a die cut by Birch Press Designs, the Hugs Sugar Script, and a Hero Arts Sentiment, heat embossed in white on black cardstock. So I'm going to show you a couple of other cards I did with the same technique. This one is not going to require such an arm workout. So the panel here I've made in the exact same way as we did before. I've used this time primary blue Topaz for my base 4 layers, and then over the top I'm going to be adding a different colour, and you'll see the reason for that in a second. I'm going to be adding over the top primary Bluetiful, such a great name. So as before, I added the embossing ink by swiping over the top of the panel, and then I sprinkled on primary Bluetiful. I then heated up the panel and melted it. I'm now going to be using a Grateful Heart stamp set, which is a clear acrylic stamp set, so different to the red rubber. And I've prepped the stamps. I'm not going to be using the sentiment stamp in the end. I've prepped them by putting them onto an acrylic block. And just while I heat up my panel, I'm also adding some totally teal embossing glitter in places here and there, just sprinkling on for a little bit of shine. And as before, I'm heating up my panel. I'm then taking the floral stamp and pushing it into the melted embossing powder on the panel. If you try and lift it up straight away, as you see there, it will stick slightly. I recommend leaving it for a few seconds just to cool. And you get this amazing impression that's created in the embossing powder. And when you leave it to cool, it's set. You can obviously heat it up and erase it, but what you'll see with the 2 colours that we used is where the embossing powder is being pushed in, the colour that lies underneath shows through, and it almost looks like enamel. So, you know, pottery or crockery. You can see up close here what a great effect that gives you. I also added a Hero Arts sentiment in the centre in the exact same way. You can use the heat tool to direct the heat to the centre, remelt and add the sentiment. And I then just simply mounted it onto a Nina Solar White £110 card base. You will notice that the panel is slightly smaller than A2 size. That's because I used a stitched rectangle die to cut my panel of WOW embossing cardstock before I added my embossing powder initially. So on to my final card. This time I'm going for a more greenish look, and I wanted to kind of try and mirror some of the pottery I know my mum used to have from the, I want to say, olden days. It's not that long ago, but some of you might recognise that colour. So I've initially embossed my panel as before, 4 layers of primary Chartreuse. I'm then adding over the top Oyster Glintz as my final 2 layers. I'm just showing you 1 layer here. So I think it's 3 layers of primary Chartreuse and 2 of Oyster Glintz. And when you melt this, it looks like it basically gives a super sheeny, pearly look to the Chartreuse itself. It's absolutely stunning in real life, and it's a shame you can't see it on here on video. I'm now using the MFT Stamps Magical Mandala red rubber background stamp, and I'm not using my MISTI this time. I'm holding down the background stamp, and then because of the shape of this background stamp, it makes it pretty easy to just lift it up, peek underneath, check if it's made the impression. If not, just add some more heat tool, lift it up, peep underneath, add a bit more heat tool, push it down, and repeat. And by doing it this way, you definitely are going to avoid melting your MISTI, although I would say that's actually quite tough to do. But it also makes it a little bit easier on your muscles, even though it does look like I'm straining there, it wasn't too hard. And this is the image. It's very distressed looking because of the layers that we've added of the Oyster Glintz and the Chartreuse, but I love how it turned out. I added a layered Hello die. I just die cut it twice, once from grey cardstock and once from green, which is by Catherine Pooler, and popped it all up onto a grey card base. The sentiment is also from Hero Arts. And that finishes the tutorial today. Thanks for joining. Be sure to subscribe and don't forget to click the bell if you want to be reminded when we have new video. Bye!